Nero Wolfe and the Black River Pact. It was a Wednesday morning in March when the trouble walked through our front door, though at the time I thought it was just another woman with too much money and too little sense. I was wrong on both counts. I was in the office going through the mail when the doorbell rang. Fritz was upstairs with Wolfe, so I answered it myself. The 5 Dobermans, Nero, Caesar, Brutus, Cassius and Marcus, had taken their usual positions around the front hall when they heard the bell. They didn't growl, but their ears were up and their dark eyes followed my every move. Even after 6 months in the brownstone, they still made visitors nervous. The woman on the stoop was maybe 45, with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and clothes that whispered money instead of shouting it. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched a black leather purse. "Are you Archie Goodwin?" she asked. "Guilty. And you are." "My name is Helen Vance. I need to see Nero Wolfe immediately. It's about the Black River Pact." I'd never heard of the Black River Pact, but something in her voice, a tremor of genuine fear, made me step aside. "Come in, Mrs. Vance. Mr. Wolfe is with his orchids until 11. But she was already inside, and I noticed how the Dobermans reacted. Their heads turned as one to track her movement, and Nero, the alpha of the pack, took a step forward. She froze. "They won't hurt you," I said, "unless I tell them to, which I won't, assuming you're here on legitimate business." "I am. God help me, I am." I led her to the red leather chair in front of Wolfe's desk. She perched on the edge like she might bolt at any second. The dogs settled back into their watching positions, but I could tell they were still alert. "Coffee?" "No, thank you." "When will Mr. Wolfe be available?" "In about 20 minutes. Want to tell me what this is about?" Her knuckles were white where she gripped the purse. The Black River Pact was made 30 years ago. 5 young people, barely out of college, thought they were so clever. We swore an oath by the river, sealed it with blood. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Dramatic fools we were. But now someone's trying to collect on that old debt, and yesterday I received this. She opened her purse with trembling fingers and withdrew a single sheet of expensive cream paper. The message was typed in the center. "The river remembers. Pay what you owe, or join the others. You have until Friday." "Others?" I asked. 2 of the 5 are already dead. Car accident last month for Margaret Thorne. Heart attack 3 weeks ago for James Kellerman. The doctors said it was natural, but she shuddered. That leaves only 3 of us. Myself, Arthur Brenklin and David Morse. What exactly did this pact involve? Before she could answer, I heard Wolfe's elevator descending. Helen Vance went rigid as a board, and the Dobermans stirred restlessly. They always knew when Wolfe was coming down. The elevator stopped, and Wolfe emerged, a mountain of a man in a yellow shirt that could have doubled as a tent. He carried a spray of Cattleya orchids, which he set carefully in the vase on his desk, before settling into his chair with the precision of a battleship docking. His dark eyes took in Helen Vance with the same attention he'd give to a new orchid species. "Good morning, madam. I understand you wish to engage my services regarding something called the Black River Pact." "Yes, Mr. Wolfe. I'm Helen Vance, and I'm afraid for my life." Wolfe's grunt was non-committal. He picked up the threatening note I'd passed to him and read it without expression. "You speak of 5 people. 2 are dead. That leaves you and 2 others. Arthur Brenklin and David Morse." "Yes." "And this pact?" Helen Vance's composure finally cracked. She pressed her hands to her face and began to sob. "We killed someone, Mr. Wolfe, 30 years ago by the Black River. It was an accident, at least we told ourselves it was. But we covered it up. We swore never to speak of it, never to see each other again if we could help it. And now someone knows." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his substantial belly. The orchids caught the morning light, beautiful and serene, a sharp contrast to the anguish in the red leather chair. "Phew," he said finally. "Take your melodrama elsewhere, madam. I have no interest in ancient accidents or the guilty consciences they engender. But Mr. Wolfe, Archie, show Mrs. Vance out." I started to rise, but she was faster. "Wait, I can pay whatever you ask." I have money. Money is not the issue. The issue is that your problem is 30 years old and likely exists only in your imagination. Good day. She stood, her face flushed with anger now instead of fear. You're making a mistake, Mr. Wolfe. When the third body turns up, remember that I came to you first. She strode out, and I followed to make sure she made it past the Dobermans without incident. They watched her go, but didn't move from their positions. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was examining his orchids with the air of a man who'd just avoided stepping in something unpleasant. You're really going to let her walk away? I asked. I am. Even though she's probably right about those 2 deaths not being natural, especially because of that. Ancient crimes bore me, Archie. Let Inspector Kramer earn his salary for once. I was about to argue when the phone rang. I answered with my usual charm. Nero Wolfe's office. Archie Goodwin speaking. Goodwin. This is Kramer. Is Wolfe there? He's here. What's the occasion? Tell him we just pulled David Morse out of the Hudson River. Apparent suicide. But there are some things that don't add up. And Goodwin? Yeah? Morse had a piece of paper in his pocket. Same cream stock as the one you probably saw this morning. Same message about the river remembering and paying what you owe. I looked at Wolfe, who was suddenly very still. I'll tell him, Inspector. You do that, and tell him that if he's already working this case, I want to know about it. Now. I hung up and relayed Kramer's message. Wolfe sat in silence for a long moment, his eyes closed. Confound it, he said finally. Change of heart. Mrs. Vance was correct about one thing. The third body has turned up. Perhaps it's time I took an interest in this Black River Pact after all. Wolfe's change of heart lasted exactly until I reminded him that investigating would require him to leave the brownstone. Absolutely not, he declared, attacking his lunch of broiled lobster with Fritz's special sauce. If Mrs. Vance wishes to engage my services, she may return this afternoon. I will listen to her story in detail and advise her accordingly. From the comfort of your chair. Precisely. I put down my fork. The Dobermans were arranged around the dining room like furry sentinels, and I could swear they were smirking at Wolfe's stubbornness. This is murder we're talking about, not a missing person case. 3 people are dead, and there might be 2 more on the list. Then perhaps Mrs. Vance and her remaining confederates should consider relocating to a distant climate. You're impossible. I am rational. I refuse to go charging about the city chasing ghosts from the 1940s. That's when Inspector Kramer chose to ring the doorbell. The Dobermans were on their feet instantly, and even through the thick walls of the brownstone, we could hear his distinctive growl when Fritz told him Wolfe was at lunch. He can wait, Wolfe said calmly, dissecting another piece of lobster. He doesn't sound like he's in a waiting mood. 5 minutes later, Fritz appeared in the doorway looking apologetic. Inspector Kramer insists on seeing you, sir. He says it's urgent. Wolfe sighed the sigh of a martyr. Very well, show him in. Kramer stomped into the dining room, like a man with a grievance against the world. He was a big, solid cop with grey hair and a face that had seen too much of the wrong side of humanity. The Dobermans watched him carefully, but they'd met him before and knew he wasn't a threat to Wolfe. Nice dogs, he said sarcastically, taking in their positions, training them to attack process servers. They're merely cautious around strangers, Wolfe replied. What brings you here, Inspector? David Morse. Pulled him out of the drink this morning, and the preliminary report says he was dead before he hit the water. Blunt force trauma to the head. I see. And you believe this connects to the woman who visited me earlier? Kramer's eyes narrowed. So you do know about the Black River Pact? I know that Mrs. Vance mentioned it. I know that she claimed 2 of her associates had died recently, and I know that you've now confirmed the death of a third. What I want to know is whether you're working the case. Wolfe considered this while buttering a roll. I am not. Mrs. Vance attempted to engage my services, but I declined. Why? The matter struck me as tedious. Kramer looked like he wanted to throw something. Tedious? 3 people are dead, and you find it tedious? Ancient secrets rarely interest me, Inspector. If you'll excuse me, I have orchids to tend. After Kramer left, still fuming, I cornered Wolfe in the office. He was reading a seed catalogue with the concentration most people reserve for the Bible. "You know you're going to take this case," I said. "I am not. Helen Vance will double your fee." "Irrelevant." "Triple it." He looked up from the catalogue. "You think me so easily bought?" "No, I think you're curious. You've been sitting there for the last hour, trying to figure out what 5 college kids could have done 30 years ago. That's worth killing for today. And you're annoyed because you don't have enough information to even make a decent guess." Wolfe closed the catalogue with a snap. "Your presumption is insufferable." "My presumption is accurate. When Helen Vance comes back this afternoon, you're going to take the case. The only question is whether you're going to make me do all the legwork while you sit here like a Buddha, or whether you're actually going to get involved." "I will not leave this house." "Fine. Then I'll be your legs, as usual. But first I want to know what you think really happened 30 years ago." Wolfe was quiet for a long moment. Outside I could hear the distant sound of traffic and the closer sound of Fritz humming in the kitchen. The Dobermans had settled into their afternoon positions, 3 in the hallway, 2 in the front room. "Archie," he said finally, "what would drive 5 young people to make a blood pact by a river? Guilt, fear, the need to keep a secret." "Precisely. And what secret would be worth preserving for 3 decades? Murder, or worse." I stared at him. "What's worse than murder?" Before he could answer, the doorbell rang. Helen Vance was back, and this time she wasn't alone. The man with Helen Vance was tall and thin, with a kind of pale complexion that comes from spending too much time indoors. His hands shook worse than hers had that morning, and when the Dobermans moved to flank the hallway, he nearly bolted. "Easy," I told him. "They're friendlier than they look." "I doubt that," he muttered. I led them both to the office, where Wolfe was arranging papers on his desk with his usual precision. He looked up as we entered, and I saw his eyes catalogue every detail of our new visitor. "Mrs. Vance," he said, "I trust you've reconsidered my advice about distant climates." "This is Arthur Brenklin," she said without preamble. "He's the other survivor." Brenklin remained standing even after I'd seated Helen Vance in the red leather chair. He looked around the office like a man expecting an ambush. "Mr. Brenklin," Wolfe said, "please sit. If I'm to hear this story, I'd prefer my witnesses comfortable." "I'd rather stand." "I'd rather you sit." There was something in Wolfe's voice that made argument pointless. Brenklin took the yellow chair, perching on the edge like he might need to run. Wolfe leaned back and interlaced his fingers. "Now then, you spoke this morning of 5 young people and a pact made by the Black River. I assume this was in New York State." "Yes," Helen Vance said. "About 30 miles north of the city. There's a spot where the river bends, creates a little pool surrounded by trees, very secluded. And the 5 participants were yourself, Mr. Brenklin, the deceased David Morse, Margaret Thorne, and James Kellerman." "That's right." "The year?" 1945. We were all recent graduates. Columbia, Barnard, Princeton, young and stupid, and convinced we were smarter than the world. Wolfe's grunt conveyed his opinion of youthful arrogance. "Proceed." Helen Vance looked at Arthur Brenklin, who was staring at his hands. When he didn't speak, she continued. "We'd been friends since college. Not romantically involved, just a group that clicked, you know. We'd meet every weekend, sometimes in the city, sometimes at David's family place up near the river. We called ourselves the Quintet." "How original," I murmured. She shot me a look. "We thought we were being clever. Anyway, that summer we were all struggling. The war had just ended, but jobs were scarce, and we all had expectations that weren't being met. David had family money, but the rest of us were scraping by. What sort of work were you seeking?" "I wanted to be a journalist." Arthur was studying law. Margaret had dreams of the stage. James was trying to break into finance. And Mr. Morse? David didn't need to work. His family owned textile mills, shipping companies, that sort of thing. Old money. Wolfe nodded. "Continue." "There was a man," she said, and her voice dropped. "Gerald Hoffman. He'd been David's roommate at Princeton. and he had opportunities for us. Ways to make money quickly. Legal ways. The silence stretched so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, Arthur Brenklin spoke for the first time since sitting down. "No," he said, "not legal." Wolfe's eyebrows rose a fraction. "What manner of illegality?" "Import business," Brenklin said. Hoffman had connections with some Europeans who needed to move certain items into the country quietly. Art, jewelry, that sort of thing. Probably stolen during the war. But we didn't ask too many questions. "And your role in this enterprise?" "We were to be the front. Clean American faces with good connections. We'd purchase the items through legitimate channels, then resell them to Hoffman's buyers. The profit margin was substantial." "How substantial?" Helen Vance answered. $5,000 each for the first job. More than most of us made in a year. I whistled softly. That was serious money in 1945. "And what went wrong?" Wolfe asked. The two survivors exchanged another look. This time it was Helen who spoke. "Hoffman double-crossed us. The first shipment was larger than he'd said, and when we went to make the delivery, there were complications. Police were asking questions about some of the pieces. Apparently they were more hot than we'd realized. So you decided to end the arrangement." "We tried to. We met Hoffman at the river spot to tell him we were out, but he laughed at us, said we were in too deep to quit, said he had evidence that would send us all to prison if we tried to back out." Wolfe was very still. And then James lost his temper," Arthur Brenklin said. "He shoved Hoffman, and Hoffman stumbled backward. There was a rock jutting out from the bank, and Hoffman hit his head on it when he fell." "Was he killed instantly?" "No," Helen whispered. "He was unconscious, but breathing. We could have gotten help. Should have gotten help. But we panicked."
"What did you do?"
"We held him underwater until he drowned." The office fell silent, except for the sound of the Dobermans shifting in the hallway and the distant hum of city traffic. Wolfe's face showed no expression whatever. "All 5 of you participated in this drowning?" "Yes," Brenklin said. "We told ourselves it was mercy, that he might have brain damage from the head injury anyway, but really, we were just scared kids who saw our lives falling apart. And afterward, we made the pact," Helen said, "cut our palms with David's pocket knife, and swore by the river that we'd never speak of what happened, never see each other again if we could help it. Take the secret to our graves." "But you did see each other again?" "Occasionally. Chance meetings in the city, that sort of thing. We'd nod politely and move on. It worked for 30 years. Wolfe opened his desk drawer and withdrew a beer opener, applying it to the first of 2 bottles Fritz had left for him. He poured carefully, creating the perfect foam cap he insisted upon. "Who else knew about Gerald Hoffman's death?" "No one," Brenklin said quickly. "We were the only witnesses." "You're certain?" "Absolutely. We dumped the body in a deep part of the river, weighted down with rocks. As far as the world knew, Gerald Hoffman simply disappeared." Wolfe drank beer and considered this. Yet someone clearly knows about the Black River Pact. Someone who has killed 3 of your number and threatens the remaining 2. "That's why we're here," Helen said. "We need your help." "Indeed you do. Unfortunately, your story presents several difficulties. Such as, if Gerald Hoffman's body was never discovered, and if only the 5 of you knew what happened, then your current tormentor must be someone with access to information that shouldn't exist." I could see where he was going with this. Someone who knew Hoffman. Someone who's been waiting 30 years for revenge. "Or," Wolfe said, "someone who has discovered evidence of your crime and decided to exact their own form of justice." He reached for the threatening note Helen had brought that morning. "This paper is expensive. The typing is professional. The language is educated, but not flowery. Your blackmailer is intelligent, patient, and methodical." "Can you find him?" Helen asked. Wolfe's smile was thin. "I can try. My fee is $25,000, payable in advance." Both survivors gasped. "That's outrageous," Brenklin protested. "That's my fee for cleaning up 30-year-old murders. Take it or leave it." Helen Vance opened her purse and began writing a check. We'll take it. After they left, I found Wolfe in the kitchen, conferring with Fritz about dinner. The Dobermans had followed him, and they lay in a semicircle around the stove like furry disciples waiting for wisdom. 25 grand, I said. Nice work if you can get it. The fee is commensurate with the risk. What risk? He looked at me with the expression he reserved for particularly dim orchid specimens. Archie, our clients have just confessed to murder. If I fail to identify their blackmailer, they will likely be next on his list. And if I do identify him, what? Then I will have to decide whether justice requires me to turn my own clients over to Inspector Kramer. I thought about that, while Fritz explained his plans for the evening's duck. $25,000 was a lot of money, but as Wolfe had just made clear, we might end up earning every penny of it. The next morning I started my investigation the way I always did, by making Wolfe uncomfortable. I need to go see the scene, I announced over breakfast. He looked up from his scrambled eggs with the expression of a man who'd just been told his orchid collection was infested with aphids. The Black River, where it happened. That was 30 years ago, Archie. Any evidence is long since washed away. Maybe, but I want to see the spot anyway. Get a feel for it. Wolfe's grunt indicated his opinion of feelings as investigative tools. Very well, but first, I want you to call Saul Panzer. Have him look into the deaths of Margaret Thorne and James Kellerman. Looking for what? Proof that they were murdered. If our clients are telling the truth about the Black River Pact, then someone has been eliminating them systematically. I want to know how it was done. I called Saul from the office phone while the Dobermans arranged themselves around the room. They'd gotten used to my calls, but they still paid attention when I was discussing business. Saul Panzer was the best freelance operative in New York, a small, quiet man with the instincts of a bloodhound and the persistence of a tax collector. He agreed to look into the 2 earlier deaths and promised to report back by evening. After that, I drove north along the Hudson River, toward the spot Helen Vance had described. The Dobermans watched me go from the front window, and I could swear they looked disappointed not to be coming along. The Black River was more of a large stream, really, winding through wooded hills about 30 miles from the city. I found the bend easily enough, a secluded pool surrounded by oak and maple trees, with a small clearing on the bank, where someone had once built a fire ring. It was a beautiful spot, peaceful and private, perfect for picnics, romantic meetings, or disposing of inconvenient bodies. I walked around the clearing, trying to imagine 5 scared college graduates holding a man underwater 30 years ago. The rock Helen Vance had mentioned was still there, jutting out from the bank like an accusatory finger. Dark stains on its surface could have been anything: rust, algae, or 30-year-old blood. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps on the path behind me. "You're trespassing," a voice said. I turned to find a man in his 60s watching me from the tree line. He wore work clothes and carried a shotgun with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it. "Sorry about that," I said. "I was just looking around. This is private property, has been for 15 years. You own it?" "I'm the caretaker. Name's Tom Fletcher." He stepped closer, and I saw that his eyes were sharp and intelligent, despite his casual manner. "You wouldn't be the first person to come looking for whatever happened here back in the 40s. That got my attention. Other people have been here, 3 or 4 over the years. Always asking about the same time period. Always interested in that rock there." He nodded toward the blood-stained stone. "You a cop?" "Private investigator. Archie Goodwin, working for Nero Wolfe." His eyes widened slightly. "The fat detective? Heard of him. What's his interest in ancient history?" "Someone's been killing people who used to come here 30 years ago." Fletcher leaned against a tree and cradled his shotgun. "That'd be about Gerald Hoffman, I suppose." I kept my face neutral, but inside I was doing cartwheels. "You knew Hoffman?" "Knew of him. I was just a kid then, working for the family that owned this land, but I remember the talk when he disappeared." "What kind of talk?" "He'd been coming here regular like with a group of young folks, city types, all dressed up and trying to act like they belonged in the country. Then one day he just stopped showing up, and a week later someone reported him missing. But his body was never found." Fletcher's smile was thin. Bodies don't always stay where you put them. Rivers got a strong current, especially after heavy rains. Something goes in up here might not surface for miles downstream. Did anyone ever search this area? Oh sure, police came around, asked questions, but they were looking for signs of foul play, and there weren't any visible by then. Case went cold pretty quick. I thought about this as I drove back to the city. If Fletcher was right about bodies moving downstream, then the 5 conspirators might not have been as clever as they thought. Gerald Hoffman could have been found eventually, just not connected to the Black River. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office reading seed catalogues, while the Dobermans dozed around his chair. He looked up as I entered.
Well?
I told him about my conversation with Tom Fletcher. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Interesting, he said finally. This Fletcher fellow has been watching that site for 15 years. He might know more than he's admitting. Want me to go back and lean on him? Not yet. First, let's see what Saul has discovered about our client's deceased friends. As if on cue, the doorbell rang. Saul Panzer's timing was always impeccable. The Dobermans stirred as I went to answer the door, but they knew Saul and settled back down when they saw who it was. Saul came into the office carrying a manila folder and wearing his usual expression of quiet satisfaction. He was a small man with forgettable features, which made him perfect for surveillance work. What did you find? Wolfe asked without preamble. Enough to confirm your suspicions, Saul replied, settling into the yellow chair. Margaret Thorne's car accident wasn't an accident. The brake lines had been cut, but the investigating officer missed it because the damage was disguised to look like normal wear. How do you know this? I talked to the mechanic, who examined the wreckage. He noticed the cuts but assumed they happened in the crash. When I pressed him, he admitted they looked too clean to be accidental damage. Wolfe nodded. And James Kellerman? Heart attack, as reported. But he was in perfect health according to his doctor, and there was no family history of cardiac problems. I had a friend at the coroner's office take another look at the blood work. And? Digitalis. Enough to stop a horse. The original examiner missed it because he wasn't looking for it, and digitalis metabolizes quickly. I whistled. So we've got 3 murders disguised as natural deaths and accidents. Very professional work, Wolfe agreed. Our killer is patient, skilled, and has access to detailed information about his victims. Any thoughts on who that might be? Saul asked. Before Wolfe could answer, Fritz appeared in the doorway looking agitated. Mr. Wolfe, Inspector Kramer is here. He seems very angry. Show him in. Kramer stormed into the office like a man with a personal grievance against gravity. The Dobermans watched him carefully. Their ears pricked forward. We need to talk, he announced. Good evening, Inspector. May I offer you beer? You can offer me some straight answers, starting with why you didn't tell me yesterday that Helen Vance and Arthur Brenklin are wanted for questioning in a 30-year-old murder case. Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. I was unaware that they were.
Well, they are now. Gerald Hoffman's body turned up this afternoon.
The silence in Wolfe's office was so complete, I could hear the Dobermans breathing. Even they seemed to sense the importance of what Kramer had just announced. Where? Wolfe asked finally. Construction crew digging the foundation for a new bridge about 20 miles downstream from your Black River. Hoffman was caught in the old pier supports. Probably been there for decades. Kramer's voice was grim. Coroner says he died from drowning, but there's evidence of blunt force trauma to the head. And get this, his wrists were bound. I felt the pieces click into place. So it wasn't just a panicked cover-up. Someone tied him up and threw him in the river. That's what it looks like. Which means your clients lied to you about the accidental nature of Hoffman's death. Wolfe reached for his beer, but his hand paused halfway to the glass. Inspector, you said the body was found this afternoon. How did you connect it to Mrs. Vance and Mr. Brenklin so quickly? Hoffman had a little black book in his jacket pocket. Names, addresses, meeting places. Your 2 clients are mentioned several times, along with the other 3 who've turned up dead recently. I see. And you wish to question Mrs. Vance and Mr. Brenklin about their relationship with the deceased. I want to question them about murder. Both the old one and the recent ones. Wolfe finally picked up his beer and drank thoughtfully. The Dobermans shifted restlessly, picking up on the tension in the room. "Inspector," he said at last, "I believe you're making an error in connecting the old murder with the recent ones." "How so?" "Consider the timeline. Gerald Hoffman dies 30 years ago, under circumstances that suggest premeditation rather than panic. Mrs. Vance and her friends cover it up and go their separate ways. For 3 decades, nothing happens. Then suddenly, 3 of the original 5 are killed in rapid succession. So why wait 30 years for revenge? If someone close to Hoffman knew about the murder, why not act immediately? Why allow the killers to live full lives before exacting retribution?" Kramer frowned. Maybe the killer just found out about it. Perhaps. Or perhaps the recent murders have nothing to do with Gerald Hoffman's death. "Then what's your theory?" Before Wolfe could answer, the doorbell rang. Through the front window, I could see Helen Vance on the stoop, and she looked scared. "That'll be one of your murder suspects now," I told Kramer. Perfect timing. I let Helen in, noting how the Dobermans reacted to her presence. They were more alert than usual, their heads up and ears forward. Something about her was different tonight. She hurried into the office and stopped short when she saw Kramer. "Oh, I didn't know you had company."
"Mrs. Vance," Wolfe said smoothly, "allow me to present Inspector Kramer of the NYPD. Inspector, Mrs. Helen Vance."
"We need to talk," Kramer said, rising from his chair. "I'm sure we do, but first I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe privately." "No dice, lady. You're wanted for questioning in connection with the murder of Gerald Hoffman." Helen Vance went very still. "They found him this afternoon, along with evidence that ties you and your friends to his death." She sank into the red leather chair as if her strings had been cut. "After all these years—"
"Mrs. Vance,"
Wolfe interrupted, "before you say anything further, I should inform you that anything you tell Inspector Kramer may be used against you in court."
"I know that."
She looked up at Kramer with eyes that had aged decades in the last few minutes. "What do you want to know?" "Start with your relationship to the deceased." He was our business partner. Gerald had connections, ways to make money that weren't entirely legal. We were young and broke and thought we were smarter than we actually were." "What kind of business?" Helen glanced at Wolfe, who nodded slightly. "Import business. Art, jewelry, probably stolen goods from Europe. Gerald would arrange for us to purchase items through legitimate channels, then resell them to his buyers." "And it went wrong?" "Gerald got greedy, started demanding a larger cut, threatening to expose us if we didn't agree. We arranged to meet him at the river to discuss terms. And instead, you killed him." "No." The word came out like a gunshot. "We didn't kill him." Kramer's eyebrows shot up. "The evidence suggests otherwise." "We were planning to kill him," Helen said. "God help us. We'd actually decided to go through with it. We brought rope to tie him up, planned to make it look like an accident. But when we got there, he was already dead." The office fell silent again. Even the Dobermans seemed to be holding their breath. "Explain," Wolfe said. "His body was floating in the pool when we arrived. Someone had gotten there first." "Who?" "We never found out. We panicked, assumed we'd be blamed if the body was discovered. So we weighted it down and sank it. Then made our pact never to speak of what we'd seen." Kramer looked skeptical. "You expect me to believe you're innocent of Hoffman's murder?" "I expect you to investigate further before deciding," Helen replied with more backbone than I'd given her credit for. "Mrs. Vance," Wolfe said, "why didn't you tell me this yesterday? Would you have believed me? Would anyone? 5 young people show up to commit murder and find their intended victim already dead. It sounds like something out of a melodrama." "It sounds like a lie," Kramer muttered. "Nevertheless," Wolfe said, "it may be the truth. Mrs. Vance, think carefully. When you arrived at the river that night, did you see anyone else? Any signs that someone had been there recently?" Helen closed her eyes, concentrating. "There were tire tracks in the mud by the access road. Fresh ones, different from ours." "What kind of vehicle?" "Something heavy. A truck, maybe. The tracks were deeper than what a car would make." Kramer was taking notes now. "Anything else?" "Gerald's body, there was something wrong with it. Wrong how? He was fully dressed, but his shoes were missing, and his wallet was gone, but his watch and cufflinks were still there, expensive ones. I exchanged glances with Wolfe. A robber would have taken the jewelry first. Mrs. Vance, Wolfe said, I need you to think about the people who knew of your arrangement with Mr. Hoffman, anyone who might have had reason to kill him. I don't know. Gerald was secretive about his other business dealings. He mentioned having partners, but he never told us who they were. What about his personal life? Family? Friends? He was unmarried. No close family that I knew of. He lived alone in a brownstone on the Upper East Side. Kramer stood up. Mrs. Vance, I need you to come to the station and make a formal statement. Is she under arrest? Wolfe asked. Not yet, but she's a material witness in a murder investigation. Helen Vance looked at Wolfe pleadingly. What should I do? Go with Inspector Kramer, tell him the truth. All of it. And then we find out who really killed Gerald Hoffman, and more importantly, who's been killing your friends. After they left, I found myself alone with Wolfe and the Dobermans. The dogs seemed restless, moving around the office instead of settling into their usual positions. You believe her? I asked. Her story has the ring of truth. It's too outlandish to be fabricated. So if Helen and her friends didn't kill Hoffman, who did? Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his desk. Someone who knew about their plan. Someone who arrived at the river first and eliminated Mr. Hoffman for reasons of their own. One of Hoffman's other partners? Possibly. Or someone with a more personal motive. Such as. Before he could answer, the phone rang. I picked it up expecting to hear Kramer's voice, but instead got a surprise. Is this Archie Goodwin? The voice was male, cultured, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Speaking. Who's this? Someone who knows the truth about the Black River Pact. Meet me tomorrow at noon at the Riverside Cafe on 79th Street. Come alone. Wait a minute. The line went dead. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. Our mysterious killer wants to chat. Indeed. How thoughtful of him to arrange a meeting. You want me to go? Certainly not alone. This could be a trap. Then what? Wolfe smiled, and for the first time since this case began, he looked genuinely interested. Then we spring a trap of our own. The next morning, I spent an hour with Wolfe planning the meeting at the Riverside Cafe. The place was perfect for surveillance. A small restaurant overlooking the Hudson with good sight lines and multiple exits. I want Saul positioned across the street, Wolfe instructed. You'll go in first and take a table by the window. If this person doesn't show or if things go wrong, you leave immediately. What about backup? Inspector Kramer will be informed of the meeting 30 minutes beforehand. That should give him time to position his people without interfering with our plans. The Dobermans seemed to sense something was happening. They followed me around the brownstone all morning, their dark eyes alert and watchful. At 11:30, I drove to the Upper West Side and parked 3 blocks from the cafe. Saul was already in position across the street, reading a newspaper on a bench like any other New Yorker, enjoying the afternoon. The Riverside Cafe was exactly what I'd expected, small, dim, and half empty. I took a table by the front window and ordered coffee, keeping one eye on the door and the other on the street. At 12:05, a man entered and looked around the dining room. He was medium height, maybe 50, with silver hair, and the kind of expensive clothes that whispered money. When he spotted me, he approached with the confidence of someone used to being in control. Mr. Goodwin, that's me. You're the one who called. My name is Victor Hoffman. Gerald was my younger brother. I managed to keep my expression neutral, but inside I was recalculating everything. Have a seat, Mr. Hoffman. He settled across from me and signaled the waitress for coffee. His movements were precise, economical, like a man who never wasted effort. You're surprised, he observed. A little. Your brother's been dead for 30 years. Yes, but I've only recently learned the circumstances of his death. How recently? Victor Hoffman's smile was thin. 6 months ago. That's when I discovered Gerald's files in a storage facility I inherited from our father. What kind of files? Records of his various business enterprises, names of associates, details of transactions, including extensive documentation of his relationship with 5 young Americans who were helping him move stolen goods into the country. The waitress brought his coffee. He drank it black, his eyes never leaving my face. "Mr. Hoffman," I said carefully, "are you the one who's been killing the members of the Black River Pact?" "I am." The casual admission hit me like a physical blow. I'd been expecting denials, evasions, anything but a straightforward confession. "Why?" "Justice, Mr. Goodwin. My brother was murdered, and his killers lived free for 30 years. I simply corrected that oversight. And now there are 2 left, Mrs. Vance and Mr. Brenklin. I thought it only fair to give them a sporting chance. By hiring Nero Wolfe?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "I didn't hire Mr. Wolfe. Mrs. Vance did that herself." "Then why call me?" "Because I want him to understand that this is personal. My brother may have been a criminal, but he was still family. The people who killed him don't get to walk away simply because 3 decades have passed." I leaned back in my chair. "There's just one problem with your theory of justice, Mr. Hoffman. Which is, your brother wasn't killed by the members of the Black River Pact. He was already dead when they got there." For the first time, Victor Hoffman looked surprised. "That's impossible. According to Helen Vance, they arrived at the river planning to kill your brother, but found his body floating in the water." "She's lying." "Maybe, but Gerald's body was found yesterday, and according to the police, he'd been bound with rope before being thrown in the river. That suggests premeditation, not the panicked reaction of scared college kids." Hoffman was quiet for a long moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup. "If that's true," he said finally, "then I've been killing the wrong people." "It looks that way. Who killed Gerald?" "That's what we're trying to find out." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. "These are copies of Gerald's files. Everything he had on the import business, his associates, his clients. If someone else killed him, the answer might be in here." I took the envelope. "Why give this to me?" "Because if I've been wrong about Mrs. Vance and her friends, then my brother's real killer is still out there, and I want him found." "What about the murders you've already committed?" Victor Hoffman's face hardened. "I'll deal with the consequences of my actions, but first I want the truth about Gerald's death." He stood up, leaving money on the table for his coffee. "Tell Mr. Wolfe that I'll be staying at the plaza until this matter is resolved. If he needs to reach me, he can call the hotel." After he left, I sat for a few more minutes, thinking about what I'd just heard. Then I signaled Saul and headed back to the brownstone. Wolfe was in the potting room with his orchids. When I returned, the Dobermans followed me up from the main floor, their nails clicking on the stairs.
"Well,"
he asked without looking up from the catleya he was examining. I told him about my conversation with Victor Hoffman, including the confession to 3 murders. When I finished, he set down his magnifying glass and faced me. "Did he seem unbalanced to you?" "No more than anyone else who's just confessed to serial murder. He was calm, rational, completely convinced he was in the right." "And the files?" I held up the manila envelope. "Everything Gerald Hoffman had on his business dealings." "Excellent. We'll go through them after lunch." "What about Victor Hoffman himself? Do we call Kramer?" Wolfe considered this. "Not yet. First, let's see what those files tell us about Gerald Hoffman's death." We spent the afternoon in the office going through Gerald Hoffman's papers. The Dobermans arranged themselves around the room, occasionally lifting their heads when we made interesting discoveries. And there were discoveries. Gerald Hoffman had been running a much larger operation than Helen Vance had realized. His import business involved dozens of people, from European suppliers to American buyers, with millions of dollars changing hands. "Look at this," I said, holding up a carbon copy of a letter. Hoffman was putting pressure on one of his suppliers, a man named Klaus Weber in Switzerland, threatening to expose Weber's wartime activities if he didn't increase shipments. Wolfe read the letter over my shoulder. "Blackmail is a dangerous business, Archie. Mr. Weber might have decided to eliminate the threat. Weber's in Switzerland. How would he get to the Black River? He might have associates in America. Or he might have made the trip himself." I kept digging through the files. Here's something else. Hoffman was keeping detailed records on all his American partners, including our 5 college graduates. But look at this. I showed him a file folder labeled Insurance. Inside were photographs, documents, even what looked like surveillance reports on Helen Vance and her friends. He was gathering evidence against them, Wolfe observed. Enough to send them all to prison if something went wrong. No wonder they wanted him dead. Indeed. But as Mrs. Vance told us, someone beat them to it. The phone rang. I answered to find Inspector Kramer on the line, and he sounded agitated. Goodwin, where the hell were you this afternoon? I had men positioned all around that cafe, and you never showed.
I was there.
So was our mysterious caller. Then why didn't you? Oh. He wasn't what we expected. Not even close. His name is Victor Hoffman, and he's Gerald Hoffman's brother. There was a long pause. The Victor Hoffman, who's been staying at the plaza under an assumed name for the last 6 months. You know about him. We know about him now. Hotel finally ran his credit card through the system and discovered the name was fake. We've been trying to locate him since yesterday. Well, you can stop looking. He confessed to killing Margaret Thorne, James Kellerman, and David Morse. Jesus Christ, where is he now? Said he was going back to the plaza. But Inspector, there's something else you need to know. I told him about Victor Hoffman's claim that his brother had been murdered by someone other than the Black River Pact members. That's convenient, Kramer said skeptically. Maybe, but the evidence supports it. Gerald Hoffman was bound with rope before being thrown in the river. That's not something scared college kids would think to do. So what are you saying? I'm saying we may have 2 separate murder cases here. The old one, involving Gerald Hoffman, and the recent ones involving his brother's revenge. After I hung up, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes, his eyes closed in concentration. Archie, he said finally, call Mrs. Vance. Ask her to come here this evening, and tell her to bring Mr. Brenklin. What for? I want to hear their story again. In light of what we've learned about Gerald Hoffman's business practices, I suspect there are details they've omitted. You think they're still lying? I think they're scared people who've been keeping secrets for 30 years. It's time they told us everything. Helen Vance and Arthur Brenklin arrived at 8 o'clock, both looking like they'd aged another decade since I'd seen them last. The Doberman stirred restlessly as Fritz showed them into the office, and I noticed that the dog seemed more agitated than usual. Wolfe waited until they were seated before speaking. I trust Inspector Kramer treated you well during your questioning. As well as could be expected, Helen replied. He seems to think we're guilty of Gerald's murder despite what I told him. And what exactly did you tell him? The truth, that Gerald was already dead when we arrived at the river. Wolfe leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Vance, I've spent the afternoon reviewing Gerald Hoffman's business files. His operation was considerably more extensive than you indicated. She shifted uncomfortably. I told you we didn't know all the details. Indeed, but I suspect you knew more than you've admitted. For instance, were you aware that Gerald was blackmailing his European suppliers? Arthur Brenklin spoke for the first time. We suspected something. Gerald had too much leverage over people for someone who was supposed to be just a middleman. And were you aware that he was collecting evidence against all of you? The silence stretched until Helen finally nodded. We found out the week before he died. How? David saw some papers in Gerald's apartment. Photographs, documents, records of our meetings. Gerald was building a case against us. Wolfe's eyebrows rose, yet you still planned to meet him at the river. We thought if we could eliminate Gerald, we could destroy the evidence and be free of the whole mess. But instead, you found him dead. Yes. Mrs. Vance, I need you to think very carefully about that night. You say Gerald's body was floating in the river when you arrived. Was there any indication of how long he'd been dead? She closed her eyes, remembering. His skin was cold, but not stiff yet, and there was still blood in the water around his head. So he'd been killed recently. Within an hour or 2, I'd guess. Wolfe nodded. And the 5 of you disposed of the body to avoid being connected to his death. We were terrified, Brenklin said. Even though we hadn't killed him, we knew we'd be suspected. We had motive, opportunity, and we'd been planning to do exactly what someone else had done first. A reasonable fear, Wolfe agreed. Now about Gerald's files. Did you find and destroy the evidence he'd collected against you? Helen and Arthur exchanged glances. We never found them, she admitted. We searched his apartment, but the files weren't there. Then where? I began, but Wolfe held up a hand. Archie, would you ask Fritz to bring coffee, and perhaps something stronger for our guests? While Fritz was preparing refreshments, the Dobermans moved restlessly around the office. Nero, the pack leader, kept looking toward the front of the house, as if he'd heard something. Mr. Wolfe, Helen said, have you learned anything about who's been killing us?
Indeed I have.
This afternoon I met with Victor Hoffman, Gerald's brother. He confessed to the murders of your 3 friends. Both survivors went rigid. Where is he now? Brenklin asked. Presumably at his hotel. Inspector Kramer is looking for him. Why did he kill them? Revenge for his brother's death. Victor recently discovered Gerald's files and assumed you and your friends were responsible for the murder. But we weren't. So you claim. And Victor Hoffman now seems inclined to believe you. Fritz returned with coffee and brandy. The Dobermans followed him, still acting agitated. Something was making them nervous. The question, Wolfe continued, is who actually did kill Gerald Hoffman 30 years ago? Does it matter now? Helen asked. Gerald's been dead for 3 decades. His killer could be dead too. Perhaps. But Victor Hoffman wants the truth, and I'm inclined to give it to him. That's when Nero started growling. It was a low, rumbling sound that made everyone in the room freeze. The other 4 dogs quickly joined in, their ears flat against their heads, their eyes fixed on the hallway. Someone's in the house, I said, reaching for the gun in my desk drawer. The lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in a second later, but the office was still dim. Through the doorway, I could see shapes moving in the hallway. Everyone stay calm, I said, but Helen Vance was already screaming. The Dobermans erupted into motion, charging toward the hallway with a sound like thunder. There were shouts, the crash of furniture, and then a gunshot. Fritz, Wolfe bellowed. I'm all right, sir, came the reply from the kitchen. The lights came back on, revealing a scene of chaos. 2 men in dark clothing were on the floor in the hallway, one unconscious and bleeding, the other trying to fend off 3 snarling Dobermans, while the 4th dog stood guard over Fritz in the kitchen doorway. Call them off, the conscious intruder shouted. I whistled, and the dogs backed away, but remained alert. The man on the floor looked familiar. I'd seen his face in Gerald Hoffman's files. Klaus Wibber, I presume, Wolfe said calmly. The man's eyes widened in surprise. How did you? You're mentioned extensively in Gerald Hoffman's correspondence. I assume you're here to recover certain incriminating documents. Webber struggled to his feet, favoring his left arm where one of the Dobermans had grabbed him. His companion wasn't moving. Those files belong to me, Weber said. Actually, they belong to Gerald Hoffman's estate, but I'm curious why wait 30 years to come looking for them. I didn't know they existed until Victor Hoffman contacted me last month. I kept my gun trained on Weber while working out the implications. Victor's been investigating his brother's death. He must have traced the European connections. Victor Hoffman is a fool, Weber spat. He accused me of killing Gerald, but I told him the truth. Gerald was alive when I left him that night. Wolfe leaned forward slightly. You were at the Black River 30 years ago. I came to America to deal with Gerald personally. He was becoming too dangerous, threatening to expose my wartime activities if I didn't increase my shipments. So you arranged to meet him? Yes, but I didn't kill him. I offered him more money, a better arrangement. Gerald agreed to the new terms. And then I left. Gerald was alive and planning to call off his meeting with the American partners. He said he had a better way to handle them. Helen Vance had stopped screaming and was listening intently. What do you mean, a better way? Weber looked at her with contempt. Gerald knew you were coming to kill him. He'd been watching you, gathering evidence of your plan. That's impossible, Brenklin said. Is it? Gerald was paranoid about security. He had people watching, all his associates, including the 5 of you. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Are you suggesting that Gerald Hoffman knew about the planned ambush? I'm saying he was prepared for it. When I left him at the river, he was setting a trap for his would-be killers. The office fell silent, except for the sound of the unconscious intruder's labored breathing and the distant wail of police sirens. Mr. Weber, Wolfe said finally, if Gerald Hoffman was prepared for an ambush, and if you didn't kill him, then who did? Weber's smile was cold. Why don't you ask them? They were there. All eyes turned to Helen Vance and Arthur Brenklin, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable. We told you, Helen said weakly. Gerald was already dead when we arrived. Perhaps, Wolfe said. But I suspect there's more to the story. The police sirens were getting closer. Weber's unconscious companion was starting to stir, and the Dobermans were still agitated from the break-in, but Wolfe seemed completely unfazed by the chaos. Mrs. Vance, he said quietly, it's time for the complete truth. She looked around the room like a trapped animal. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Mr. Weber has just told us that Gerald Hoffman was expecting your ambush, that he was prepared for it. Gerald couldn't have known, but he did know. He had surveillance on all of you, remember? He knew about your plan to kill him. Arthur Brenklin had gone very pale. We should wait for our lawyers. By all means, Wolfe said. But first let me tell you what I think happened 30 years ago. The front door burst open, and Inspector Kramer charged in with half a dozen officers. They took in the scene, 2 intruders, one barely conscious, the other nursing dog bites, and our 2 clients looking guilty as sin. What the hell happened here? Kramer demanded. A home invasion, I said. Meet Klaus Weber and his associate. They broke in looking for Gerald Hoffman's files. Weber? Kramer looked at the bleeding man with interest. We've been wanting to talk to you about some wartime activities. I want a lawyer, Weber said. You'll get one. After we sort out what happened here tonight. While Kramer's men secured the intruders and called for medical assistance, Wolfe continued his analysis. Inspector, he said, I believe we're about to solve 2 murder cases, one 30 years old and 3 that are considerably more recent. I'm listening. Klaus Weber came to America in 1945 to confront Gerald Hoffman about his blackmail demands. They met at the Black River, but Weber didn't kill Hoffman. Instead, he made a deal with him. What kind of deal? Gerald would stop the blackmail in exchange for a more profitable arrangement. But Gerald had another problem. 5 American partners who were planning to murder him. Kramer looked at Helen Vance and Arthur Brenklin, so he decided to eliminate them first. Not exactly. Gerald was too clever for simple violence. He preferred manipulation. Get to the point. Wolfe smiled. Gerald knew about the planned ambush because he had his partners under surveillance, so he arranged a counter-ambush of his own. With who? With the one person he trusted completely, the one person who had access to information about all his business dealings and his American partners. I saw where Wolfe was going, and the pieces fell into place. Someone who knew about the meeting at the river. Someone who could get there first and set up a trap. Precisely. Someone who had intimate knowledge of Gerald's security arrangements and his methods of operation. Helen Vance was shaking her head frantically. No, that's not what happened. Gerald was alone when we found him. Was he? Mrs. Vance? Are you certain of that? The silence stretched until Arthur Brenklin finally spoke. There was someone else there that night. Helen whirled on him. Arthur, don't. It's over, Helen. It's been over for 30 years. Kramer moved closer. What are you talking about? Brenklin looked at his hands. When we got to the river, Gerald wasn't alone. There was someone with him. Who? David Morse. The name hit the room like a physical blow. David Morse, the wealthy one. David Morse, whose family place was near the river. David Morse, who had been murdered just days ago by Victor Hoffman. David was working with Gerald, Brenklin continued. He'd been feeding Gerald information about our plans, helping him build cases against us. Why? Kramer asked. Money. David's family fortune was tied up in trusts. He needed cash, and Gerald was paying him well for intelligence on his American partners. Wolfe nodded approvingly. So when David learned of your plan to kill Gerald, he warned his employer. Gerald was furious, Helen said, finally giving up the pretense. He accused us of betrayal, said we'd forced his hand. And then? And then he ordered David to kill us. The office went very quiet. Even the Dobermans seemed to be listening. David had a gun, Brenklin said. Gerald had given it to him for protection, but when the moment came, David couldn't go through with mass murder. So what happened? David turned the gun on Gerald instead. Kramer was taking notes furiously. David Morse killed Gerald Hoffman. Yes, Helen said. Shot him in the head, and then helped us dispose of the body. We made the pact not just to cover up Gerald's death, but to protect David from a murder charge. And for 30 years, you all kept the secret. Until Victor Hoffman started killing us. Brenklin said, David knew he was next on the list, so he tried to disappear. But Victor found him anyway. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, looking satisfied. A tidy solution to an old mystery. David Morse killed Gerald Hoffman to save his friends, then spent 3 decades living with the guilt. There's just one problem, I said. David Morse is dead. Victor Hoffman killed him, thinking David was one of Gerald's murderers, which technically he was. Ironic, Wolfe observed. Victor Hoffman got his revenge without knowing it. Kramer closed his notebook. Mrs. Vance, Mr. Brenklin, you're under arrest as accessories to murder. You have the right to remain silent. As Kramer read them their rights, I couldn't help thinking about the twisted justice of it all. Victor Hoffman had murdered 3 people seeking revenge for his brother's death, and by pure chance, he'd killed the one person who was actually guilty. The Dobermans had settled down now that the intruders were in custody. They arranged themselves around the office in their usual positions, as if nothing had happened. What about Victor Hoffman? I asked Wolfe. Inspector Kramer will arrest him for 3 counts of murder. The fact that one of his victims was guilty of killing his brother may earn him some sympathy, but it won't save him from the consequences of his actions. And Klaus Weber? War crimes are outside my jurisdiction. Inspector Kramer can sort that out with the appropriate authorities. Fritz appeared in the doorway, looking apologetic. Mr. Wolfe, I'm afraid dinner will be delayed. The kitchen is something of a mess. Understandable, Fritz. We'll make do with sandwiches tonight. As the police led away their prisoners, and the medical team tended to the wounded intruder, I found myself alone with Wolfe and the Dobermans. Satisfied? I asked. Reasonably. The case is solved. Justice has been served, and we've earned our fee. What about the moral complexities? Victor Hoffman was seeking justice for his brother's murder, even if he went about it wrong. Wolfe considered this while opening a beer. Justice is a luxury we can afford only when we know all the facts. Mr. Hoffman acted on incomplete information and became a killer himself. And David Morse? David Morse made a choice 30 years ago to save his friends rather than follow orders to murder them. He paid for that choice with a lifetime of guilt, and eventually with his life. I thought about the 5 young people who had gone to the Black River in 1945, full of themselves and convinced they could outsmart the world. 2 had died natural deaths. 1 had been murdered by his own employer, and 2 would now spend their remaining years in prison. Not exactly a happy ending, I said. Wolfe's smile was thin. Happy endings are for fairy tales, Archie. In the real world, we settle for accurate conclusions and appropriate consequences. The Dobermans yawned and began settling in for the night. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to the human dramas that played out in brownstones and boardrooms and lonely spots by dark rivers. Come on, I said. Let's help Fritz clean up the kitchen. After a case like this, we could all use something normal to do. The next morning brought reporters, more police interviews, and a visit from the district attorney's office. The Dobermans took their usual positions around the front hall, eyeing each new visitor with the suspicion that had served us so well the night before. Wolfe endured the attention with his usual grace, which is to say he answered questions with the minimum number of words required and glowered at anyone who interrupted his routine. The case is closed, he told Assistant District Attorney Phillips. The murderer of Gerald Hoffman is dead, killed by the victim's brother in an act of misguided vengeance. Mrs. Vance and Mr. Brenklin are accessories after the fact. What about this Klaus Weber? He seems to know more about Hoffman's operation than he's admitting. Mr. Weber's activities, during and after the war, are matters for the appropriate federal authorities. I have no interest in them. Phillips wasn't satisfied, but he could see that Wolfe was finished with the subject. After he left, I found Wolfe in the kitchen conferring with Fritz about lunch. The reporters want interviews, I told him. They can interview the heir. I have nothing further to say about this matter. What about Victor Hoffman? He's still at the plaza, waiting to hear what we discovered. Wolfe was quiet for a moment. Call him. Tell him that his brother was indeed murdered, but that the killer is dead. Justice has been served, though not in the way he expected. That's all? That's sufficient. I made the call from the office phone, while the Dobermans watched. Victor Hoffman listened to my summary, without comment, then asked a single question. Was Gerald's killer one of the people I murdered? Yes. David Morse shot your brother to prevent a multiple homicide. There was a long silence. So Gerald died trying to have his partners killed. That's right. Then I suppose justice was served, even if I didn't know it at the time. What will you do now? Turn myself in to Inspector Kramer. Face the consequences of my actions. After he hung up, I sat for a while thinking about the circular nature of justice. Victor Hoffman had killed 3 people seeking revenge for his brother's death, and by chance had executed the actual killer. Now he would pay for his crimes, but with the knowledge that his quest for justice had succeeded in its own twisted way. The doorbell rang, interrupting my philosophical musings. I went to answer it, noting how the Dobermans moved to defensive positions automatically. Tom Fletcher, the caretaker from the Black River, stood on our stoop looking uncomfortable. Mr. Goodwin? I read about the case in the papers. Thought you might want to know something. I led him to the office, where Wolfe was reading seed catalogues with his usual concentration. Mr. Fletcher was the caretaker at the Black River site. I told Wolfe. He has something to add to our story. Fletcher remained standing despite Wolfe's gesture toward a chair. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about bodies moving downstream. Got me wondering about something I saw 30 years ago, which was night those young folks had their last meeting by the river. I was doing my rounds and saw lights down by the water. Figured it was them having one of their parties, so I didn't interfere. But I did see a truck leaving around midnight, big black truck, driving without headlights until it reached the main road. Wolfe looked up from his catalogue. Did you recognize the vehicle? Wasn't from around here, that's for sure. But I did notice something odd about it. What? Had New York plates, but they weren't the right color for that year. Looked like they'd been painted or altered somehow. I exchanged glances with Wolfe. Mr. Fletcher, did you ever mention this to the police when they investigated Gerald Hoffman's disappearance? Nope. Figured if those young folks wanted to sneak around with fake plates, it wasn't my business. People got up to all kinds of shenanigans after the war ended. After Fletcher left, Wolfe sat in thoughtful silence for several minutes. The truck Klaus Weber mentioned, he said finally. Has to be. Weber came to meet Gerald in a vehicle with false plates, probably stolen or borrowed for the occasion. Which confirms his story about leaving Gerald alive. If Weber had killed Hoffman, he would have mentioned the truck to deflect suspicion. So Weber was telling the truth? About not killing Gerald? Yes. About his other activities? Probably not. The phone rang. It was Inspector Kramer, and he sounded tired. Thought you'd want to know, he said. Victor Hoffman just surrendered himself, walked into the precinct an hour ago, and confessed to 3 counts of murder. How's he holding up? Better than most killers. Seems almost relieved to have it over with. What about the Vance woman and Brenklin? They'll plead guilty to being accessories after the fact, probably get 5 to 10 years each, considering their age and the circumstances. And Klaus Weber? That's where it gets interesting. The feds took him into custody this morning. Turns out he's been on their wanted list for years. War crimes, art theft, murder. He'll be lucky if he sees daylight again. After Kramer hung up, I found myself thinking about the strange symmetry of the case. 5 young people had made a pact by a dark river 30 years ago, binding themselves to silence about a murder they hadn't committed, but had covered up. Now 3 of them were dead, 2 were facing prison, and the actual killer had been executed by his victim's brother in an act of unknowing justice. "Penny for your thoughts," I said to Wolfe. He looked up from his catalogue. "I was thinking about the nature of secrets, Archie, how they bind people together and tear them apart simultaneously. The Black River Pact. Indeed, 5 young people swore to keep a secret that wasn't even theirs to keep. They spent 30 years living in fear of exposure for a crime committed by one of their own group. David Morse must have been carrying a hell of a burden all these years. The burden of having killed a man to save his friends, then watching those friends live in terror of a crime he had committed. Yes, I imagine that weighed heavily on his conscience. The Dobermans had settled into their afternoon positions around the office. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, but inside the brownstone, there was finally peace. "What about our fee?" I asked. $25,000 for solving a 30-year-old murder and preventing 2 more. I'd say we earned it. Helen Vance's check will probably bounce when she's sentenced. Then we'll consider it a donation to the cause of justice. That evening, after Fritz had served one of his spectacular dinners and the Dobermans had been fed their own substantial meal, I found myself alone with Wolfe in the office. He was reading as usual, while I caught up on correspondence. "You know what bothers me about this case," I said. "What?" "If David Morse hadn't turned the gun on Gerald Hoffman, the other 4 would have been murdered that night. David saved their lives, and they all spent 30 years thinking they were accessories to murder instead of potential victims. Life is full of such ironies," Wolfe observed. "The truth is often more complex than it appears, and justice rarely follows the paths we expect. Speaking of justice, what do you think will happen to Victor Hoffman? He'll be convicted of 3 counts of murder and sentenced accordingly. The fact that one of his victims was guilty of killing his brother may earn him some consideration, but it won't excuse his crimes. And Klaus Weber will face justice for crimes committed during and after the war. At his age, it's unlikely he'll survive long enough to complete whatever sentence he receives." I thought about that for a while, listening to the comfortable sounds of the brownstone settling for the night. The Dobermans were quiet, finally relaxed after the excitement of the previous evening. "One more question," I said. "Only one. If you had been one of those 5 kids 30 years ago, would you have made the same choices they did?" Wolfe was quiet for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, he set down his book and looked at me. I hope I would have had the courage to tell the truth immediately, regardless of the consequences, but I was never 23 years old and terrified of my own shadow. It's easy to judge other people's choices from the safety of 3 decades distance. That's not really an answer. It's the only answer I can give honestly. Outside, the city settled into its nighttime quiet. The case of the Black River Pact was closed, its secrets finally revealed, its debts paid in full. 5 young people had made a choice by a dark river 30 years ago, and now finally they were free of it. Well, the 3 who were still alive were free of it anyway. The other 2 had paid a different price entirely. 3 weeks later, I was in the office sorting through the mail when I found an envelope with familiar handwriting. No return address, but the expensive paper and precise script told me who it was from. "Letter from Victor Hoffman," I told Wolfe. He looked up from the orchid catalogue he was studying. "What does he say?" I opened the envelope and read the single page inside. "He thanks us for finding the truth about his brother's death. Says knowing that Gerald's killer paid the price makes his own situation easier to bear. Anything else? He's been sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 25 years. At his age, that's effectively a death sentence." Wolfe nodded, and he accepts that. Says he understands that justice required a price for his crimes, regardless of his motives. I folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. Outside, it was a beautiful spring day, the kind that made you forget about dark rivers and 30-year-old secrets. The doorbell rang, and Fritz showed Inspector Kramer into the office. The Dobermans barely stirred. They were used to official visitors by now. Thought you'd want to know how things turned out, Kramer said, settling into the red leather chair. I assume you're referring to the various defendants in our recent case? Helen Vance and Arthur Brenklin pled guilty to accessory after the fact. Got 7 years each, with possibility of parole in 3. Lenient, considering they helped cover up a murder for 30 years. Judge took their age and the circumstances into account. Also the fact that they were originally planning to be victims, not perpetrators. And Klaus Weber? Extradited to Germany yesterday. Turns out he's wanted for a lot more than art smuggling. The feds think he was involved in some concentration camp activities during the war. I whistled softly. Gerald Hoffman had chosen his business partners poorly. What about the stolen art that was part of Hoffman's operation? I asked. Still tracking it down. Amazing how much Nazi loot ended up in American private collections after the war. This case has opened up a whole new line of investigation. After Kramer left, Wolfe went back to his catalogues while I finished the correspondence. The Dobermans dozed in their usual positions, occasionally lifting their heads when delivery trucks passed by outside. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind I'd learned to appreciate after 30 years of working for Nero Wolfe. The brownstone was quiet. Fritz was humming in the kitchen, and there were no clients with desperate problems demanding immediate solutions. That's when the doorbell rang again. This time it was a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair and nervous eyes. She clutched a small purse and looked around the office as if expecting an ambush. Mr. Wolfe. My name is Sarah Kellerman. James Kellerman was my uncle. Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. James Kellerman had been the second victim in Victor Hoffman's revenge spree, supposedly dying of a heart attack that was actually Digiotto's poisoning. Please sit, Miss Kellerman. How may I help you? I've been reading about the Black River Pact case in the newspapers, about how my uncle and his friends covered up a murder 30 years ago. That's correct. The thing is, Mr. Wolfe, I don't think my uncle was involved in any murder cover-up. I exchanged glances with Wolfe. What makes you say that? Because my uncle kept a diary all his life, and according to his entries from 1945, he was in California that entire summer, working for a movie studio. The office fell very quiet. The Dobermans sensed the tension and raised their heads. Miss Kellerman, Wolfe said carefully, are you certain about this? I have the diary with me. Would you like to see it? She opened her purse and withdrew a small leather-bound book. The pages were yellowed with age, but the handwriting was clear and consistent. July 15th, 1945, she read. Another long day on the set. The director is a tyrant, but the pay is good. Can't wait to get back to New York, but this job should last through September. She flipped through several more pages, all documenting James Kellerman's activities in Hollywood during the summer of 1945. August 20th, 1945, she continued. Got a letter from David today. Says the gang is getting together for some kind of business venture, but I'm stuck here until the picture wraps. Wolfe leaned forward in his chair. Miss Kellerman, if your uncle wasn't present at the Black River that night, then there were only 4 people who made that pact, not 5. I felt the familiar chill that came with realizing a case wasn't as closed as we'd thought. But your uncle was on Victor Hoffman's list, I said. He was murdered along with the others. I know, that's what bothers me. If Uncle James wasn't part of the Black River Pact, why did Victor Hoffman think he was? Wolfe was very still. An excellent question, Miss Kellerman. May I examine that diary? She handed it over, and Wolfe read several pages with his usual attention to detail. When he finished, he set the book on his desk and looked at me. Archie, call Inspector Kramer. Tell him we need to discuss the Kellerman murder.
What's wrong?
Sarah Kellerman asked. If your uncle wasn't at the Black River 30 years ago, then someone gave Victor Hoffman incorrect information about the participants in the Black River Pact. You mean someone lied to him? Or someone made an honest mistake? But either way, it means Victor Hoffman killed an innocent man. I was reaching for the phone when it rang. The caller ID showed the number for the Manhattan Correctional Center. Nero Wolfe's office, I answered. Mr. Goodwin, this is Victor Hoffman. I'm allowed one phone call, and I needed to speak with you. What about? I've been thinking about what you told me, about David Morse being Gerald's killer. Something doesn't add up. What do you mean? I've been going through Gerald's files again, and I found something I missed before. A letter from James Kellerman dated 2 weeks before Gerald's death. My blood ran cold. What did the letter say? That James couldn't make it to the river meeting because he was still in California. He suggested they proceed without him and fill him in later. I looked at Wolfe, who was listening intently to my side of the conversation. Mr. Hoffman, I said, where exactly did you get the names of the Black River Pact participants? From Gerald's files, of course. There was a list of 5 names: Helen Vance, Arthur Brenklin, David Morse, Margaret Thorne, and James Kellerman. But if James Kellerman wasn't there, then I killed an innocent man. Victor Hoffman said quietly. God help me. I killed a man who had nothing to do with my brother's death. After I hung up, the office was silent, except for the sound of Sarah Kellerman crying softly. Miss Kellerman, Wolfe said gently, I'm afraid we may have uncovered an additional injustice in this case. You mean my uncle really was innocent? It appears so. The question is whether Victor Hoffman made an honest mistake, or whether someone deliberately misled him. I was thinking about the implications when the pieces suddenly clicked into place. Wait a minute, I said. If James Kellerman wasn't at the river, but his name was on Gerald Hoffman's list, then who else might not have been there? Wolfe's eyes narrowed. An astute question, Archie. What if the Black River Pact involved fewer than 5 people? What if someone added names to the list later? For what purpose? To spread suspicion. To make it harder to identify the real participants. Sarah Kellerman looked up from her tissue. Are you saying someone used my uncle's name as a cover story? It's possible, Wolfe said. Miss Kellerman, did your uncle ever mention Gerald Hoffman in his diary? She flipped through the pages. Once or twice. Here, Gerald stopped by the studio today. Still trying to get me involved in some import business, but I told him I'm not interested. When was that entry made? June 1945, about a month before the night at the river. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed in concentration. Archie, he said finally, call Mrs. Vance's attorney. I want to speak with her immediately. She's in prison. Then arrange a prison visit. I suspect the Black River Pact has one more secret to reveal. As I reached for the phone, I couldn't help thinking that just when you thought a case was closed, it had a way of opening up again. The Black River had given up Gerald Hoffman's body after 30 years, but apparently it wasn't finished giving up its secrets. The Dobermans seemed to sense that we were back in business. They raised their heads and arranged themselves in their alert positions, ready for whatever new revelations the case might bring. Outside, the spring afternoon continued its peaceful progress, indifferent to the human complications unfolding in a brownstone on West 35th Street. But inside, we were about to discover that the truth about the Black River Pact was even more complex than we'd imagined. 2 days later, I sat across from Helen Vance in the visitor's room at the Women's Correctional Facility. Prison hadn't been kind to her. She looked older, more fragile, but there was something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Relief, maybe, or resignation. Thank you for coming, Mr. Goodwin, she said. I wasn't sure you would. Mr. Wolfe has some questions about James Kellerman. Her face went pale. What about James? He wasn't at the Black River that night, was he? The silence stretched so long I thought she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she shook her head. No, James was in California. Then why was his name included in the Black River Pact? Because we needed 5 names to make the story believable. 4 young people covering up a murder sounded suspicious. 5 sounded like a real conspiracy. Whose idea was it to add his name? David's. He said James would never find out, and it would help protect the rest of us. I leaned forward. Mrs. Vance, who else wasn't really there that night? She looked at me with eyes full of 30 years' worth of guilt and fear. Margaret Thorne, she whispered. Margaret had broken her leg 2 days before. She was in the hospital. The pieces fell into place with an almost audible click. So there were only 3 of you at the river. You, Arthur Brenklin, and David Morse.
Yes.
And David killed Gerald Hoffman to save you and Arthur. That's right. Then we decided to include Margaret and James in the pact to muddy the waters. We figured, if anyone ever investigated, having 5 suspects would make it harder to determine who was really guilty. But Margaret and James agreed to this. We told them Gerald had died accidentally, and that we needed their help to avoid being blamed. They were our friends. They wanted to protect us. I sat back, thinking about the terrible irony of it all. Margaret Thorne and James Kellerman had spent 30 years thinking they were accessories to an accidental death, when in reality they were completely innocent. And Victor Hoffman had murdered them both, seeking revenge for a crime they'd never committed. When I got back to the brownstone, I found Wolfe in the office with Sarah Kellerman. She was reading her uncle's diary while he studied Gerald Hoffman's files. "Well?" he asked. Helen Vance confirmed it. Only 3 people were at the Black River that night: herself, Arthur Branklin, and David Morse. Margaret Thorne and James Kellerman were added to the pact later to confuse any potential investigation. Sarah Kellerman looked up from the diary. So my uncle really was innocent. Completely. And so was Margaret Thorne. They were just loyal friends who agreed to help cover up what they thought was an accidental death. Wolfe closed the file folder he'd been reading, which means Victor Hoffman killed 2 completely innocent people in his quest for justice. 3 people, I corrected. Don't forget David Morse, who was actually trying to save his friends. Indeed, David Morse killed Gerald Hoffman to prevent a multiple murder, then spent 30 years watching innocent friends live in fear of a crime they'd never committed. Sarah Kellerman wiped her eyes with a tissue. What happens now? Now you know the truth about your uncle's death, Wolfe said gently. He was murdered by a man seeking revenge for a crime James never committed. Can we prove Victor Hoffman made a mistake? We can document that your uncle was in California when Gerald Hoffman was killed. Whether that will affect Victor Hoffman's sentence is up to his attorney and the courts. After Sarah Kellerman left, I found myself alone with Wolfe and the Dobermans. The dogs seemed subdued, as if they understood that this case had taken a darker turn. So what's the final tally? I asked. Wolfe counted on his fingers. Gerald Hoffman, murdered 30 years ago by David Morse to prevent multiple homicides. Margaret Thorne, murdered by Victor Hoffman, under the mistaken belief she was involved in his brother's death. James Kellerman, murdered by Victor Hoffman, for the same erroneous reason. David Morse, murdered by Victor Hoffman, the only victim who was actually guilty of killing Gerald Hoffman. And Victor Hoffman himself will spend the rest of his life in prison, having achieved a kind of twisted justice by pure accident. I thought about the 5 young people who'd met by the Black River in 1945. 3 had actually been there, 2 had been added to the story later. Now all 5 were dead or facing prison, victims of a secret that had taken on a life of its own. You know what the real tragedy is? I said. What? If David Morse had just told the truth 30 years ago, that he'd killed Gerald Hoffman to save his friends, he probably would have been acquitted. Self-defense, defense of others. A good lawyer could have made a case. Perhaps. But David was 23 years old and terrified. Young people don't always make rational decisions under pressure. The phone rang. It was Inspector Kramer, and he had news. Victor Hoffman's attorney is filing for a new sentencing hearing, he told me. Claims his client was operating under false information about 2 of his victims. Will it make a difference? Probably not in terms of his sentence, but it might affect how the families of the victims view his case. After he hung up, I sat thinking about justice and how rarely it followed the paths we expected. Victor Hoffman had killed 3 people seeking revenge for his brother's murder, and by pure chance had executed the one person who was actually guilty. Case closed, I asked Wolfe. Case closed, he confirmed. Though I suspect the Black River has finally given up all its secrets. The Dobermans yawned and settled into their evening positions. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human dramas of guilt and revenge, and the prices people pay for the secrets they keep. In the end, the Black River Pact had claimed 6 lives across 30 years. Gerald Hoffman, who died to prevent multiple murders. Margaret Thorne and James Kellerman, who died for crimes they'd never committed. David Morse, who died for a crime he'd committed to save his friends, and Victor Hoffman, who would die in prison for seeking justice with blood on his hands. Only Helen Vance and Arthur Brenklin survived, and they would spend their remaining years paying for the consequences of a secret they'd never needed to keep in the first place. The river, as they say, remembers everything. But sometimes, as we'd learned, memory can be more dangerous than forgetting. Outside the brownstone, New York settled into another night, carrying its countless secrets through the darkness. And in the office, Nero Wolfe opened a beer and returned to his orchid catalogues, leaving the mysteries of human nature to sort themselves out as they always had. Imperfectly, incompletely, but with a kind of rough justice that satisfied no one and everyone at the same time. The Dobermans dozed, the city hummed, and the Black River Pact finally truly came to an end.